There should be a period of time between when we learn something new and when we turn around and teach that same thing to others. How straightforward and commonsensical this idea may seem, but how rarely these days do we actually see it carried out in practice. In the information age, it's incredibly easy to go to a workshop or a retreat, spend very little time learning something new, a practice, a teaching, a perspective, and then turn around and use that as a resource or fuel for your own teaching without giving yourself a period of, let's call it, digestion. As Leslie says in this episode, when we do this, we're not actually giving the information a chance to become a part of ourselves, right? To become integrated with our cellular structure. In other words, we're not actually giving a chance for that information to be embodied. So we see this in many different areas of life, and we accept it as what is necessary for an educational process. For example, I don't know anything about the medical education trajectory, but if we imagine, for example, just for the sake of argument, if the first-year medical student was taking their first class in, conducting surgery, we wouldn't think that they could then go and perform surgery, right? There needs to be a period of, cultivating the knowledge around that, practicing perhaps on not a live person for a period of time, and then actually having the expertise, the embodied disposition to be able to carry out a surgery without danger to the other person. In the spiritual and contemplative world, we often think that yoga or meditation are practices that are so banal that we don't really need a similar kind of educational process. But today, in this conversation with Leslie, one of the things that I really appreciated about the conversation, and we talked about many things, but one of the things that we talked about was the kind of rethinking the paradigm of yoga teaching education to really reflect the process of digestion that's necessary in order to become a really skilled teacher. So he offered a three-tiered system or a three-tiered sequence of becoming a yoga teacher that I thought was really interesting. So the first thing that he says is that the 200-hour is perhaps at best a yoga instructor training. In other words, to be a yoga instructor is to essentially learn a certain sequence, learn a set of teaching practices that someone else has developed, right? Whether it's a lineage or a tradition or another group of teachers who've spent some time digesting the material and creating that sequence or that, practice of yoga. And then, and to become a yoga instructor is just to be able to kind of memorize and to parrot, and I mean that in a neutral way, not in a negative way, to be able to parrot essentially that class. And that's a lot of what many quote-unquote yoga teachers are doing. They are essentially reciting a memorized sequence. So this is to become a yoga instructor, and there's nothing wrong with that place in your yoga education, but it's different from being a yoga teacher. And that is, according to this conversation I had with Leslie, really what comes as a result of digesting the process of being an instructor over a period of time so that the teachings and the principles and the practices of yoga become digested in such a way that you can begin to articulate the teachings and the practices in your own words, right? They come from your own lived experience rather than being sort of adapted from the lived experience of other teachers who've spent more time in that process of digestion. So we have yoga instructor, we have yoga teacher, and then Leslie offered this additional tier of the yoga educator. And the yoga educator is essentially a teacher trainer, someone who has digested the process of becoming a teacher long enough that they can then go and perhaps they've developed the pedagogical skills and learned a little bit about pedagogy and how to, actually train teachers and educate teachers to then go and create a yoga 200-hour, a teacher training 200-hour, or some other advanced training. I would add an additional tier to this, which is the yoga practitioner, right? Which comes before being a yoga instructor. And I don't mean by this that someone has, practiced a lot of asana over many years. That is, of course, an important piece of the puzzle. But to become a practitioner, according to this definition that I am humbly offering here, is to actually integrate the knowledge of the tradition with the practice. So in addition to actually practicing the asanas, going to the yoga studio, you also spend some time in conversation with the teachings, right? You actually study, for example, the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, although there are other yogic texts that you could dive into as fruitful ways of really absorbing the philosophical material and the theory of the practice. But really, alongside that practice of yoga or meditation is also the synergistic relationship with the knowledge of the tradition as well. And I think in general, and this is just my opinion, that most of the time we lack this element of actually spending time with the teachings themselves when we are practicing yoga. So I'm suggesting that this idea of the yoga practitioner is actually one that integrates both the knowledge and the practice. And this is an important part as a prerequisite to becoming or going on the journey of becoming a yoga instructor. Now, why am I mentioning this? I'm not here to criticize what anybody else is doing or to, say that some people are yoga practitioners and other people aren't. It's not anything like that, and people are going to continue doing what they want to do, and that's, I think, inevitable. But what I am sort of suggesting or hoping to inspire with the conversation like the one I had today with Leslie and others that I will continue to have in the coming months here on the Chitheads podcast is to try to inspire a new paradigm of yoga education, one that really raises the bar, both on what the trajectory of learning and what the pedagogical kind of arc of yoga education looks like, and perhaps raising the bar will attract more students to this more kind of rigorous educational process. Because I think that, and this is just a little bit of a polemical opinion or perspective, over the last however many years, the kind of bar of yoga education and what it takes to become a yoga teacher has really diminished quite a bit. It's quite easy to go and get a 200-hour teacher training in a month's time with very little background with yoga, very little practice of yoga, under your belt, so to speak. And while that's totally, in some sense fine, we've been pumping out a lot of yoga teachers, and that's great. We need more yoga teachers in the world. But unfortunately, we've also seen a shrinking of, the opportunities for yoga teachers. Many yoga studios have closed in the wake of the pandemic and in COVID. And so if we have less available opportunities for teachers, we need to both think about how we can really raise the bar of yoga education so that those opportunities that are being filled with highly qualified teachers who can inspire more students into the practice and the process of yoga education. And then also, I think, raising the bar on yoga education and also thinking about the business of yoga and the organizational parameters of yoga, thinking beyond, for example, the yoga studio model and how we can take yoga to different types of environments, into schools, into prisons, into other environments where it's very needed, how we can make yoga more accessible, more inclusive. All of these different things, I think, come about from really careful conversations and explorations of the opportunity that is also a part, I think, of this kind of new paradigm of yoga education. So these are just a few of my thoughts, and obviously they're just my opinions. And we talk a lot more about other things in this conversation with Leslie Kaminoff. We talk a lot about the yoga anatomy craze in the yoga teaching community. We talk about some of what has happened, over the course of the pandemic. We talk a lot about different things that will be applicable and relevant to yoga teachers and also to people who are perhaps dreaming of becoming yoga teachers themselves or inspired to take up the process of learning how to become a yoga instructor or a yoga teacher. You can reach out to me if you have any thoughts about the episode or you were inspired by any of our conversation by reaching out to chitheads@embodiedphilosophy.com. So without any further ado, here is my conversation with Leslie Kaminoff. Hi, Leslie.
Hello, Jacob. How are you?
I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. I'm just thrilled to be here in London and having some free time to drop by. You're just an easy walk from where we've been staying.
Yeah, I was really excited to just that you were at the studio that I've been going to, Mission, which is a beautiful space owned by a wonderful person, Jenny Wilkinson Priest. Shout out to Jenny.
Shout out, Jenny.
and
And Simon.
And Simon, yes. And so, have you been to London before?
Yeah, I've been here several times to teach, and previously for Try Yoga, when Jenny was running yoga for Try Yoga. So it was just a natural thing to just follow her into the new space.
What's changed about London or the yoga community here since you were here last?
I think, the take used to be that, if you were in New York and sort of in the midst of all of this yoga scene in the States, and you'd come to Europe or England or whatever, the take would be like, how many years behind does it feel like they are, in terms of whatever the next thing is or whatever. But it doesn't feel
behind New York.
Yeah, sure. Because, a lot of the, I'd say stylistic or waves of interest in yoga tend to get brewed in, the United States, in these urban areas on the East and the West Coast. But I don't think that's the conversation anymore. I think everything is everywhere. And, I don't think of this or that country or region being ahead or behind.
Yeah.
I think there was a huge reset over the last 3 years of the whole industry. A lot of studios are gone. And the ones that survived were able to do so through streaming or, just renegotiating their leases or whatever it is that it takes to keep a physical space going in the yoga industry these days. You have to really know what you're doing.
Yeah.
It was never a high profit business to begin with, and certainly less so when, they shut you down and, people aren't coming. The fact that Jenny was able to open a brand new build out here in London is just extraordinary. I don't know anyone anywhere in the world who even would think of attempting anything on that scale in 2023.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing. And I've been observing in London that it seems like there's actually quite a few studios, especially in the South London, where it's a little bit more of kind of the Brooklyn vibe, although you have a little bit of that here.
Yeah, where the rents are a little lower.
But even I've looked at spaces just because, I've thought about, what would it be like to start a studio here? And I mean, the rents compared to New York are really much cheaper. And so it seems like here in London that there's a resurgence of of yoga practices and yoga studios in a way that New York has maybe not quite recovered as much.
Sure, and that's mostly due to real estate, I would think.
Yes, yeah.
Well, that's good to hear, because obviously I don't see everything that's happening in London. I fly in, walk around a bit, teach my workshops, and get to see my immediate surroundings, and I can hear things and having conversations like this. So you know a lot more about it than I do.
Well, and I don't know that much. I've only been to a few studios, but it does seem like the size, Mission is huge, the one you just taught at. And then it seems like the size and scale of the studios here is a little bit like what you'd find in the size and scale of studios in New York like 10 years ago. And so it's kind of made me wonder if there's a little bit of kind of a golden age of yoga happening here.
Cool. Well, maybe London is 10 years behind, because if that's the case, in 10 years, they're all going to have to close again.
Yeah. Oh, gosh. That's unfortunate.
When you talk about the big studios in New York, you're thinking of like Jivamukti and and
yes,
well, also we had the whole Yoga Works thing going on. They were just acquiring places left and right.
Yes,
overexpanding,
and then they fell apart. Yeah.
Well, it's nice to hear that there's energy here and that people are embarking on new.
Yeah.
Because from where we were sitting stateside during the pandemic, it was like lights winking out one by one. And that affects me directly, obviously, because a lot of these places that are no longer around were places that would have possibly invited me to teach and do a workshop or get involved with providing anatomy for their teachers training or something like that. So it's just not as many potential hosts out there.
Exactly. Yeah, I was speaking to Ava Taylor recently, who,
My good friend Ava Taylor.
Yeah, she's actually doing a course with us on Master the Big Four, which is like 4 principles of your yoga business, and having conversations with her about how much, she was, I mean, obviously her business was also decimated. And I'm curious what.
Well, to be fair, she was getting out of the being the talent agent for touring yogis before the pandemic.
Okay.
Right, because she was booking me.
Yeah.
At least in Europe, we were doing our own stateside thing.
I see.
But yeah, she saw the writing on the wall before the pandemic hit.
As in that there was a decrease in the opportunities.
That it had peaked. The demand had peaked.
I see.
And the market had reached a kind of a saturation.
Yeah.
And people were being a little more circumspect with how to spend their yoga dollars.
Yeah.
On things like workshops or trainings or traveling to a retreat.
Yeah. Yeah, it does certainly feel like at a certain, you can kind of remember that moment in, I guess, the early 2010s when there was a bunch of, or maybe late 2000s, early 2010s, when there was all these articles about the yoga body, and you'd see some fit, muscular slim yogi on the front cover of the New Yorker or something. And that kind of craze of yoga was at its height, but really was that the height of maybe a fitness-centered yoga?
I think, yeah. Well, it would have started in the sort of early to mid 90s, really. We were talking about this before we started recording. How the incredible surge in popularity of yoga had a lot to do with the more athletic, sweaty styles of vinyasa practice, fueled mainly by Ashtanga vinyasa teachers who were starting to come over and teach more widely. And the fitness industry, which at that point was barely 10 years old itself, said, "Wow, this is amazing. We want this in the studios. We want we want it in our gym." And amazingly, if you can imagine, at that point there was this thing that's hard to picture today, is that the demand for yoga teachers far exceeded the supply. I'm talking about early going to mid 90s.
Wow.
Right. And because, the gyms.
That's why you didn't need a yoga teacher training at that time.
That's why you needed standards. That's why we got together and figured out the 200 and 500 hour standards, because, and I say this all the time, I don't fault her at all for having this brilliant business insight, but someone like Beth Shaw was bound to jump into that gap between supply and demand and offer weekend trainings for yoga teachers. Because essentially what she did was she went to the owners of gyms and said, "Hey, you've already got people on your payroll who know how to lead group fitness. They're called aerobics teachers. Give them to me for a weekend, and at the end of the weekend, you can have yoga on your schedule, because these people now know how to teach a yoga class." That was Yoga Fit. That's how it was born.
Wow.
And so at that point, some of the folks who were hanging around and talking to each other at, Unity and yoga conferences and later Yoga Journal conferences, which started in 95. We were like, people are training teachers in a weekend. Is that okay with us? And we, shouldn't there be some minimum standard that, we're willing to put out there for what we consider to be, just baseline training for yoga teachers? That was one part of the conversation that led us to sit down and come up with these standards. As they say in Hamilton, I kind of was in the room where it happened, because, I was part of some of those meetings because of the work I had done with Unity Yoga and, the people that we were connecting who were having these kinds of conversations.
Yeah, we actually talked about this in our first interview, which I should mention to those listening that or watching that this is the second interview we've had. And we did one for Chitheads in 2000. Actually, it was a very early on interview. I think you were probably in the, I meant to look at it before, but I think it was before number 20.
Wow.
I mean, it's been going for 7 years, and I should be in the 300s by now, but I haven't been publishing that regularly. Okay. But here we are somewhere at 180. And I remember in that conversation, we talked a little bit about Yoga Alliance, and I struck a relatively critical position, and I think you had a really nuanced approach to it, because I had sort of suggested at that time that Yoga Alliance was not actually, it had standards, but it wasn't sort of overseeing and there was no way to sort of legislate those and to actually have some sense of oversight of whether or not, the standards were being implemented in the training themselves, right? So really someone could just sort of...
It's easy to game the system when no one's following up.
Right, exactly. And you could basically fill out a document that satisfied Yoga Alliance and then, conduct your training in a completely different way.
Yeah. But they were trying to implement things like, social credentialing, where there was, feedback and reviews and things like that would help to weed out the bad actors or the substandard.
Yeah. And it's changed recently. I've noticed again, it's, now you can do a 200-hour entirely online.
Well, they had to.
They had to,
There's no way they weren't going to.
Right. I sort of thought initially that they would go back after COVID, that they would sort of return, but there's no
going back.
There's no going back.
What are you going to do? You're going to tell all the people that are paying dues to your organization, which is what keeps it going, that their business model is no longer valid?
Yeah.
And also, to take a less cynical, view on it, as much as online, is deficient in the in real life aspect of yoga, which is very important to folks like us, it does make it accessible.
Yeah.
A whole range of people who otherwise wouldn't be able to
That's very true.
get this kind of training. And look, the 200 hours, the problem I always had with it is that from the beginning we called it an RYT, which is a registered yoga teacher. And my point had always been, again, to bring a little nuance to the conversation, that after 200 hours, you're at best an instructor.
Yeah.
Registered yoga instructor, which means you've been given a class to teach, someone else figured out, a sequence of some kind. And you've been given some words to say, which are not necessarily your words. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. Everyone needs that as a starting point. That was my starting point when I trained with Shivananda. I learned the Shivananda sequence, and I learned the words to say to get people to go through the sequence. And that's how I had the confidence, such as it was at the time, to get in front of a room and lead people through an hour and a half of yoga, right? Everyone needs something as a starting point, and I think 200 is a starting point. And whether you get it online or in person, as long as it's acknowledged that this is the beginning of what it takes to become a teacher, then there would have been less confusion from the get-go, and people would have less problems with things like online trainings. Because, to be honest, there's some people out there who have been trained as teachers in the post-COVID or during COVID era who have never taught an in real life class, who have been trained online, and they teach on. And I don't have a problem with that. Why would anyone have a problem with that? Some people aren't leaving their house. Some people don't feel safe going to, an in-person class, and they've been able to get whatever instruction and benefit that they can from, over the internet. Why would someone have a problem with that?
Yeah. I guess I hear the point about, it's a starting point, because it certainly is. But do you think that the missing piece there is that, generally speaking, many people approach it as if it's the beginning and the end?
Well, sure.
Yeah. And that there's not enough emphasis maybe perhaps on like how to contextualize the 200-hour into a larger sequence of kind of educational formation.
Well, that's a problem in a lot of areas of the world, not just yoga.
Yeah.
Right. Like, for example, when a surgeon treats, his job of doing whatever surgery as the beginning and the end, and as soon as the surgery's over, his job is done, goodbye, good luck, what kind of follow-up is being offered? If they saw themselves as more of a whole person healer instead of just a technician whose job is done when the last suture is done. Actually, they don't even close up. They walk out of the room and the residents are doing it, right? So, so this is a problem that's endemic in many fields, where you have this one area of focus, and the greater context of that person and their life is kind of not part of your perspective.
Yeah.
And I think that was one of Desikachar, my teacher's really strong suits is that he never lost that perspective, that he was dealing with a person who has a life and a history and a uniqueness to them. And for him, what he would call the technology, which is the techniques that they're learning, breath and movement and chanting or whatever it was he was teaching, was merely a vehicle for a relationship. But the thing that was important was the relationship. So yeah, if you go through a 200-hour training online or whatever, and your relationship with the people who trained you ends when you complete your hours and you get your certificate and like go forth and whatever, that's if it's not pretending to be anything else, I don't have a problem with that. It's like, okay, go find the next thing you're interested in.
Yeah.
Go find a teacher who you're attracted to, or another online training, or a retreat, or a conference, or whatever. It's when you pretend that it's something it isn't, I think, then, you're then there's a kind of a problem.
Yeah. I want to go back to this point that you made about, that I guess I see as a distinction that you're making between yoga instructor and yoga teacher, which
I would go beyond that. I would go yoga educator, which means someone that's capable of training another teacher.
Okay, so we have yoga instructor, yoga teacher, yoga educator.
And maybe yoga therapist, although I think there's some problematic aspects to using the word therapy, which I've talked about in the past. But I just call myself a yoga educator, even though I do one-on-one stuff with therapeutic intent.
Yeah.
Because therapists kind of, it treads on other licensed professions.
Yes. Yeah.
And avoiding any attempt to license what we do in any aspect of yoga is something I've been strongly, advocating for a long time.
Right.
It was one of the issues I had with IAYT, the body that deals with yoga therapy, is that they're perpetually on the fence about the licensing issue. And I don't know what the current leadership has, now as a matter of policy, because I'm so out of touch with it. But in the past, I was kind of taking them to task for not committing one way or the other to be for or against licensing. Because whatever decision you make, at least let your membership know where you stand so that they can decide whether they want to be part of it or not.
Yeah.
Anyway, so therapist brings up that whole thing, which is why I use the term educator. But yeah, I would say instructor, teacher, educator, which is someone that is capable of maybe creating another teacher. And if it's well defined in a way that lets you know where you stand vis-a-vis regulatory forces of the universe, maybe therapist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, okay, let's go into the weeds here a little bit. So with the yoga instructor, I hear like the qualification is essentially the 200 hours. So is it as simple as like, okay, 500 hour, now you're a yoga teacher, or would you have other
I think that's where
criteria,
you competencies and hours,
right,
and mentorship.
Mm-hmm.
If you really want to be real about it,
yeah,
that's where relationship is really important and should be emphasized. Relationship between the teacher and their students,
mm-hmm.
relationship between the evolving teacher and their mentors, and the ability to demonstrate some level of competency in generating a class sequence, in generating a dialogue that's yours and authentic, and not just parroting someone else. I have to make this point in just about every workshop I teach, because it's something that I was guilty of when I was studying with Desikachar. It's like, you don't go to and have the best meal of your life, and it's so delicious, and you want to share it with someone you care about because you want them to have this experience. The way you share it is you don't take a plate and go, here, try this meal that I just had, because that's regurgitation, and that's not how you share a meal. Now, it's absurd to think you would do that with food, but we do it all the time with information. Mm-hmm. You ingest this, and it may be making the most sense in the world to you, but in your head, it's still in someone else's words.
Yes.
Not digested and absorbed it yet. It has not become part of your cells, and you have not sorted out the parts that are going to become part of your cells from the parts that you're going to shit into the toilet, right? So it's not all going to be useful. Some of it is waste, but it takes a process of digestion for all of this to happen. And information, like food, has to be digested. So between 200 and 500 hours, there has to be some kind of period of time where, you're allowing these teachings and your experience and what you've observed and modified and understood and studied and discussed. It all becomes part of yourself. So you're capable then, hopefully at the end of, let's say, a 500-hour process, of generating a class, of generating an experience for people out of your own understanding and using your own words, or, as I do frequently, quoting with proper attribution the people who have inspired you.
Yeah.
As opposed to, pretending that you made those wise words up.
Yeah.
Whenever I quote Desikachar, I try to make it very clear to people, please remember, this thing I just said, that's something he said. Because I've actually seen, like on Instagram or whatever, after I've taught, his words being attributed to me, and it makes my skin crawl.
Yikes.
When there's sort of misattribution there.
Yeah.
Or something I said being like twisted in ways that I never meant being attributed to me. So
yeah.
What do you do?
Yeah. This brings up, I love this idea of digestion, and it's something that I feel like oftentimes one thinks about in relation to how much practice one has engaged. So, both the actual yogic practice itself, but also the practice of teaching. But another thing that kind of occurs to me, and what I was sort of wondering how it fits into this sort of hierarchy, I guess, for lack of a better word, that we're talking about is yoga philosophy and the way in which it's historically been distilled in a yoga class. So I'm thinking of the classic model of someone teaching a Dharma talk at the beginning of class, and I've been in that situation many times where I'm a little bit eye-rolling.
Classic model? As far as I can tell, Sharon and David invented that.
Okay, so that's an interesting point, because I did do much of my initial practice was at Jivamukti, actually here in London originally, and then I moved on to New York. But I remember thinking, just so many times, eye roll, just feeling like it was pat and sort of undigested. And so there's
Don't
this.
leave out the video of slaughterhouses. That's always a big part of the
video of slaughterhouse. Oh yeah.
Oh yeah, they were very much into that.
Oh yes,
indoctrination.
Yes, the vegan indoctrination.
Yeah.
Well, ahimsa, Leslie.
Yeah, but directed at whom?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, that's.
The students who were not vegans. So. Or we're going to get ourselves in trouble. So I guess one of the things that I'm interested in where it plays in is this, there is this kind of, let's say, role or position of almost like a spiritual advisor that is sort of implicitly read into the identity oftentimes of a yoga teacher by students, maybe not in all contexts, especially if they've only ever taken a yoga class at a fitness center, they don't think of that as necessarily involved. But, there is, and I remember, I don't teach asana as much anymore, but certainly there is this perception of the teacher as somehow having a sort of access to spiritual knowledge, yogic knowledge, in a way that they may not necessarily have, especially if they've been digesting the yoga in a particular way. So I'm wondering where that plays into this idea of the instructor, the teacher, the educator, the therapist. Like, is there a role for that, or is that another kind of angle entirely?
I think there's a place in the education of a yoga educator, a place for understanding some of the basic dynamics of projection.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's not just yoga teachers who are put on the pedestal, it's anyone at the front of a room in any kind of position of authority.
Yeah.
You become a blank screen for people's projections and issues that they have that have developed around people at the fronts of rooms, whether they're, teachers or priests or drill sergeants or, gurus or whomever.
Yeah.
And that's a basic fundamental human dynamic that is just as important as understanding how your lungs work or what your diaphragm does.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I think within a yogic model of knowledge, it's very easily placed in the same conversation you're having about the koshas, like Sure, it's all well and good to learn the 19 parts of the astral body if that's how you're teaching the koshas,
Yeah.
The antakarana and the 5 indriyas and karma and whatever. So fine, right? But within that, let's have a talk about actual human psychological, emotional dynamics and what you're going to be hit with at the front of a room.
Yeah.
When you start talking and leading people through a series of practices that basically opens them up to their own embodiment, to their own inner experience. It shouldn't be a surprise to people when they start being hit with these dynamics. It should have been part of their training.
That's very interesting.
As a topic, and we didn't have the foresight to put that as a number of hours spent doing that exploration specifically when we came up with 20 hours of anatomy and however many hours of philosophy and so on.
What is that module, if you were to give it a title and define it? What is that module?
I don't know, student teacher dynamics.
Okay.
Psychology of the classroom.
Yeah.
Whatever you want to call it. It's you don't want to have to learn that on the fly once you are starting to be embedded in it and having a problem with it. I mean, look, people who are explicitly trained in that, meaning, psychoanalysts and psychologists and, psychotherapists, they have issues with it.
Yeah.
It's part of their training. That's why you learn about transference and countertransference and why, if you're a therapist, you have to have a therapist who you can go to,
right?
To discuss your countertransference issues and all that. Just watch The Sopranos and see how that works. It was depicted actually quite well.
So is it safe to say that actually that would be a nice evolution of our yoga teaching model to actually it requires some sort of, I guess maybe for lack of a better term, it's some kind of accountability model where that is built into the yogic system, right? You had your teacher, your guru, as rife with discomfort that term is for many people, but it is, historically what was required to kind of be within a lineage and to ensure that, you weren't off track and for whatever, in whatever way. And that seems to have been pretty much completely dissolved partly by abuses that have come to light of teachers. So I wanted to talk to you about this actually.
Well, the hierarchical model maybe is crumbling, but the underlying psychodynamics that give rise to that are just human. Those will never go.
Of course. Yeah. But how do we, I guess, reclaim the benefits and the utility of the teacher-student relationship as teachers in a kind of culture in which more and more people are like, that's sort of intrinsically abusive and the teacher's within me and I don't need any
Well,
teacher.
I think we're already moving in a good direction that way because of all of the focus on trauma-informed yoga, and when that started to be a conversation in the yoga world, I kind of looked at some of the recommendations that were coming out. And as I sort of read the list of points that need to be emphasized to make a learning environment trauma-informed or trauma-sensitive, whatever, I'm like, this is just good teaching. This is just creating a good, safe classroom environment for everybody, whether they have trauma in their background or not. Giving people options, like, if you're not comfortable with this, you can do that, whatever. Absolutely. That's just called modification and adaptation. Desikachar was really big on that. The big one is don't tell students what they should be feeling.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And that's a big one. Invite them to have an experience and notice what they're noticing rather than, saying, if you do this, that will happen.
Yeah.
That's a big one.
Yeah.
Understanding that not everybody is going to respond in the way you expect to the things that you're saying. Like, and people are surprised when I point out what that really means in practice. It means don't tell people that they're going to have a relaxing experience in Shavasana opposed to the child.
Yeah.
We're gonna do calling Shavasana final relaxation. Like this pose of Shavasana is final relaxation. Many people find it
horribly unrelaxing.
Exactly. We had this discussion just yesterday in the workshop I taught, and I let people I invited people to go into whatever position they wanted at the end of the class. Some of them were in classic Shavasana. Some of them were in what we call constructive rest, which is sort of an internally rotated thing where you're crossing midline with your knees and your arms. Some of them are curled up on their side on the floor. It's like, great, why would I have a problem with people making a choice that works for them if my goal is for them to be relaxed? So, I think we're moving in a good direction in terms of understanding the psychodynamics of a classroom by having these sort of trauma-informed conversations. But I think we need to recognize that what makes something safe for someone who has a trauma profile is just good pedagogy. It's just good teaching. Yeah. And we need to kind of acknowledge that that's what we're talking about. And not assuming this position of all-knowing authority at the front of the room. Yeah. Or maybe not assuming it, but not deflecting it when it's projected on you. Yeah. Desikachar was a master at that, by the way. And he was like Teflon. You'd see people trying to run all kinds of trips on him all the time. And he very gracefully and benevolently would sidestep it without making the person feel like an idiot, so that's been a real role model. Yeah.
So this brings up an interesting question that I like to ask. Because as you were talking about being uncomfortable in Shavasana, the question that arises for me is there...
I want to make a distinction there. Okay. I just clarify some nuance there. Sometimes in yoga, the whole point is to deal with whatever discomfort arises and see what it is about a situation that's sort of triggering us and see if there's a way to release into it. Yes. It's not uncomfortable. Yeah. It's not like all discomfort should be avoided. Yes. But there's a big difference between that and asking someone to do something that's clearly triggering for them, that's shutting them down and denying them the space in their nervous system to make that choice not to be triggered. And that takes some skill. Yeah. But to me, that's the big conversation about yoga practice. You can go straight to Patanjali's definition of practice at the beginning of the second chapter. Tapas, Swadhyaya, Ishvara, Pranidhana. Tapas is working against the grain. You're encountering some resistance. You're working outside your samskara, intentionally. You're intentionally provoking perhaps some reaction that some knee-jerk reaction you're having to a situation, and then giving yourself the space to not react or to respond differently. That's tapas. Ishvara Pranidhana, though, that's about surrendering to something that's not, at least maybe not right now, or maybe not by its nature, perhaps going to respond to your choices. That's not under your control. Something which by its nature you can only surrender to, because that's the relationship to have with those kinds of things. And Swadhyaya, of course, as well, you need this self-reflective attitude to be able to distinguish one from the other. This is a living embodiment of the serenity. You ask for the strength to change the things you can, the serenity to accept the things you cannot, and the wisdom to know the difference. To me, that is that sutra. Yeah. Yeah. And even more powerfully, because I teach breath, that's the breath, because it's both voluntary and autonomic. So the very thing that keeps you alive is the teacher of this principle when you start working with the breath, because you run into situations where you're controlling the breath and pacing it and, shaping it in particular ways, which you can only do up to a point, at which point you lose control and something autonomic takes over. It's an amazing process when you view practice through that lens of that equation, for lack of a better term, tapas, swadhyaya, ishvara, pranidhana. So just to be clear, not all discomfort needs to be avoided. Right. Not all pleasure needs to be indulged. Yes. But how do you know the difference? Exactly. Yeah. That's the swadhyaya. Yeah. That's great. That's actually exactly what I was going to ask, because I sometimes get a little bit annoyed when I was in a class the other day and they said, just do whatever is
pleasing and pleasurable. And, I can see to the extent and the reasoning behind wanting to, lean towards that, then lean towards pain and, some sort of austere practice. But it's just true that like poses are not always comfortable. And I sometimes like to ask the question of whether or not we're trauma over informed in the sense that everything has become a trigger, right?
Where's the challenge then?
Yes.
Well, I go again to Patanjali in the sthira sukha formulation that we find again in the second chapter, where there's a sthira sukha of a learning environment. So the kind of classes that you're describing, we'll look at it this way. What is the sthira and sukha of a learning environment? I think the sukha is this attitude of inquiry. We're in UK, so I say inquire instead of inquiry. Where you're giving people the space to have their own experience, to have it be theirs, where you're not directing them towards a certain outcome, but you're saying, what do you notice? Like, try this, try that, see what you notice. That's a model for introducing inquiry into a process of teaching something. But then the question is, what is it that you're teaching? There has to be some technique that you're learning. That's the sthira. That's what gives the structure or the support for whatever's going on in the learning environment. Because if you're all in the sukha sort of inquiry stuff, it's like, yeah, just do what feels good, roll around, I'll put on some music, check in with me in a half hour, and we'll see what happened. That there's no form there. And that can make people anxious if there's not enough structure.
Yeah.
Right. Just as anxious as it makes some people to have too much structure, not enough inquiry, where you're saying, do this, do it right, here's the technique, here's how to do it properly, and if you do that, you'll get the result. And if you don't, it's your fault.
Yeah.
We've been in classes like that. We don't need to brand them. We know teach us that way, right? So so there's too much sthira, not enough sukha. Too much technique, not enough inquiry. So you have to balance the space and the boundaries in any situation. And in a learning environment, I think that's a formula that I've come to understand needs to be acknowledged. So it goes to that question of, at what point are we overindulging, this just, we don't want to challenge you because you may get triggered kind of attitude. And when you go too far in the other direction, it's like, you're just like triggering people all over the place because you're being very reductionistic and didactic, and you're treating people as if they're just these mechanisms where if they perform the techniques correctly, they'll get the result. And if not, it's their fault. And the main difference I see between an inquiry and a technique is that there's no wrong answer to an inquiry. None. That's why it's safe. Even if your response to a question like, what are you noticing, is, I'm confused. That's great. You're recognizing you're confused. That's the beginning of all knowledge. Desikachar would always say that the recognition of confusion is itself a form of clarity. It's a beautiful quote, because it makes it safe to be confused. So there's no wrong answer to an inquiry, but there's a wrong answer to a technique. If there weren't, there wouldn't be a technique. You can do Kapalabhati upside down. It's not Kapalabhati. You're pushing down like you're pooping. It's not the exercise, right? You're breathing in rhythm, but it's not Kapalabhati, right? Kapalabhati is about the exhale traveling upward. So, the difference is techniques have right and wrong answers. And the whole purpose of learning a technique is to see where you are in relation to it. How much of this can I accomplish? And the aspects of this technique that are difficult for me, what's in the way, right? Like, you learn a new way to breathe so you can unlearn your old way of breathing. You're not doing an asana to accomplish the asana so much as to undo what's in the way of the asana. And that's a subtle, nuanced perspective that I think is often lost in the pursuit of accomplishing something for the sake of it, and having this idea promoted that you'll only get the benefit once you master it, as if the benefit is somehow tied up inside the technique and you have to unlock it by perfecting the technique. I think everything you learn along the way in the direction of mastering a technique is the benefit. It's a process orientation rather than a goal orientation.
Yeah.
Because once you achieve the technique and you can do it easily, it's like, well, what good is it anymore? Just to show off, do something else. That's where another Desikachar quote becomes relevant, where it says, our yoga practice always has to be a little more clever than our habits. which is just another sort of restatement of the tapas principle.
Just a little more clever than our habits.
Yeah. Our habits are quite clever. So we have to be a little more clever than our habits.
Yeah. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
So I want to go to this question about kind of being accessible and inclusive as a teacher, which, touches on this trauma-informed subject that we've been talking about. And I guess I'm wondering about the role of this, like the student's discernment to some extent. So like, I feel like there's been this movement in recent years toward the idea that like a teacher should be universally accessible and as inclusive as possible. And of course, I agree with that. But isn't there also
inclusive as possible?
As inclusive as possible, in the sense that, one should be trauma informed. One should ameliorate one's teaching style in such a way that, people feel like they belong in that classroom. And that, of course, has to do with, issues around racism and ableism and all of this stuff.
So one should be universally accessible, trained in trauma sensitivity.
Well, I guess it's just how as a teacher because of course the student doesn't really come to the classroom knowing if this teacher is right for them. And I've heard a lot of people go to a class and it's clear that the teacher just wasn't right for them, or the style wasn't right. And they left and they were like, oh yeah, I tried yoga. It wasn't for me,
Sure.
So what is the role of the teacher in actually cultivating in their students the idea that, not all approaches are going to be the approaches that are pragmatically, best for the student? I'm thinking also maybe an example would be, because you're a teacher that focuses so much on the breath, like have you encountered like students with trauma around the breath?
Absolutely.
Such that maybe there's another...
You get them to focus on something else.
Right. Yeah. So you have a solution for those situations.
Well, you have to if you want to make what you're doing accessible. The other thing to remember is I'm a body worker, so I work with people one-on-one quite a bit. So it's clearly about that one person in that context. And a lot of what I do in groups is informed by the sort of things I've learned in one-on-one session. So there's that dynamic going on in my experience.
Yeah.
Over the last 44 years. It's a long time.
Few years older than me.
Yeah. So, well, when I hear you ask that question, I keep thinking like, what if we were having a talk about a musician, like, and should someone transpose your question to the field of music? Should a musician make his music accessible to everybody? Right. Who could potentially be listening to it, so that they don't change the station or go on. I think what you're suggesting is actually literally impossible for a single human being to do.
Yeah.
And for a musician to be in the studio or at their piano or with their guitar, composing with everyone in mind, potentially, and not wanting to offend anybody or wanting to attract everybody, what are you going to end up with? Yeah. If you're trying to appeal to everybody, you're actually, writing for
appealing
somebody.
To no one.
I think the question really is, what is authentic for that individual teacher? What do they connect with? What has transformed their life and their experience to the extent that they're willing to invest their time and energy and money in their own education and their own training? I mean, let's face it. I don't know very many people, maybe you do, who go into this field because it's such a lucrative way to make a living. I mean, maybe some people have an eye towards bigger investments and they see a place in the market where they can profit. But let's face it, this is not like investment banking. Yeah. So there has to be something driving you. There's something very personal that's driving you. Absolutely. Yeah. To pursue that kind of education in this field. And unless that is what you're out there to share, like, this is what transformed me. These are the insights I had. This is how my life got better from practicing yoga and this is the place from which I am going to share with you, then, what are we doing? We're just trying to be the least offensive people possible. I would say that if you're being true to yourself, by definition, there's a segment of humanity out there that's going to be offended by you, by your values, and that's not a problem. That's just reality. I mean, there's people out there who voted for folks who we think are idiots because of the votes they cast. And I'm not saying which side of the aisle because that applies to everybody.
We know, Leslie.
No. But still, because we're in the yoga industry, which has a predominant sort of politics attached to it. But my point is, it works the other way around as well.
Yes.
Should those people be denied the benefit of having a more embodied experience of their life and of their breath? And if some of these truths that we espouse are truly universal, won't that in the long run make them better human beings? I don't know. It's not guaranteed. I mean, unless you're using the powerful tools of yoga to disassemble your neuroses, you're just going to become a powerful neurotic, right? And we've seen that happen too.
Yeah.
So it's not a given that someone's going to be transformed for the betterment of all humanity by doing yoga, but why deny them the opportunity? By saying, this whole group of people isn't worthy of it, because yoga is for everybody. But that means that everybody who's motivated to teach yoga, if they're true to themselves, you'll find your audience, you'll find your tribe, you'll find your people, and maybe those people aren't interested in trauma sensitivity. Maybe people who have a trauma background don't belong in your classroom. That's fine. Why should there be a problem with that? And why should anyone assume the authority to be the yoga police or the yoga education police to insist that in order to be a teacher, you must master these things? So, the Alliance has taken Yoga Alliance has taken a very strong stand in terms of social justice and, diversity, inclusion, and, whatever. And that's fine. But you know what? That's not for everybody. Does that mean that you're out as far as yoga is concerned? And the people who agree with you don't have access to yoga? I don't know. These are interesting questions to ask on a sort of larger institutional level.
Yeah. That's very interesting, and I like that we're bringing this up, because I feel like there's sort of a middle path somehow being suggested between the 2 points that we're talking about. Because on the one hand, we're talking about a kind of extreme, maybe ideologically driven demand for inclusion, and then there is, on the other hand, you're talking about speaking from your truth as a teacher. But I could see where, like, if I didn't address my own shit, I could become, an authoritarian figure, and I'm following my trap path as a teacher. I've been watching Teal Swan and a lot of other cult figures recently. I'm obsessed with cults at the moment. I find it really fascinating for a lot of reasons that we don't need to get into. But what kind of I observe is, like, there can be this incredible heart-driven commitment to one's connection to whatever teachings they feel are necessary to transmit, and yet still this kind of this strong arm, almost authoritarian disposition that we could say is reflected in some past guru figures and why some of these communities fell out. So,
but aren't people being strong arms to DEI also?
DEI?
Diversity, inclusion. What's the E?
Equity and inclusion.
Yeah. I mean, there's like loyalty oaths to DEI principles that are being enacted in the workplace and for all intents and purposes by the Yoga Alliance.
So you're talking...
I'm just saying there's another point of view.
Yeah, you're suggesting that there's a form of DEI authoritarianism.
Of course there is.
Mm-hmm.
Of course there is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, look at how people are going to react to what I'm saying here into your microphone.
Yes, I was just going to say we're treading on controversial...
But it's only controversial if people aren't willing to talk about it.
Yeah.
And the fact that you know for a fact that there's folks out there who are going to hear these words I just said and want to cancel me out of existence. That's not authoritarian.
So what is the middle path? Because I've also heard you saying previously, it's not that you're not, it's like even bringing up trauma informed. I mean, you are interested in like, in the kinds of narratives that allow us to be more, let's say, compassionate and understanding of our students. And so there is a kind of, let's say, DEI light in your perspective. So I'm just curious then, with a lot of these shifts in, you know, and again, I agree with you that there are some certain politically driven ideas about the way that yoga should be taught right now that I think are worthy of criticism and worthy of real deep reflection. But I'm curious with all of these changes, taking out the kind of authoritarian element, like how has your pedagogy changed over the years? Like what have you reflected on and shifted in your own approach to your teaching?
Much more in the direction of what we've been discussing of you know, and it's interesting because it's somewhat reflected in the work that Amy Matthews and I did when we were working on this current 3rd edition of Yoga Anatomy. So we looked at the words we had written 10 years before in the 2nd edition, and there were like 1 million copies of those words out there in the world. And we were like, oh, we would never say these things this way now. You know, yeah, it involved changing some pronoun stuff to make it more inclusive, absolutely. Yeah. But also just, you know, talking about the diaphragm and what the diaphragm does. You wanted the reader to have the most embodied experience that they could. So we would say your diaphragm, like when your diaphragm does this or that may happen, you know. And so we made it more of an inquiry rather than a directed kind of the diaphragm does this. Because in reality, there's no such thing as the diaphragm floating around as an abstract platonic diaphragm. People have diaphragms. Everyone who has one can experience it, right? So to look at all of the language I use in the classroom from that perspective, and it takes a lot because, you know, we have, our habits are very clever. And particularly as teachers, we have little blocks of, you know, verbal kinds of boilerplate that we use when we're teaching. And to break into the boilerplate and look at where it was being not inclusive, where it was potentially triggering someone, and I could say it in a way that would be more accessible or more inviting to have an experience, to have an inquiry, you know. So that's a constant thing that I'm aware of, that having been a real focus of mine, I would say in the last 10 or 15 years when I have been more traveling and teaching and doing workshops away from home, and seeing all the different people all over the world and their different contexts and their different levels of understanding of yoga and of English, frankly, because, you know, there's only a few places where I need a translator.
Yeah.
You know, like Japan or in France, we had a workshop where it was translated into French. But, you know, how to, what's interesting, working with a translator is interesting because I'm using half the number of words I would ordinarily use because I'm pausing while they're being translated. So I get to think about what's coming out of my mouth next as the translator's working. And so I have to make each word mean twice as much, you know, because I get half as many of them. So that's a major evolution as far as I'm concerned, of understanding this dynamic of inquiry versus technique in the classroom. That's a major evolution. I've only identified that in terms of sthira sukha, I'd say in the last 5 or 6 years, you know, explicitly having that realization that, yeah, there's a sthira and sukha of a learning environment, and it needs to be balanced for it to be successful just as much as a cell's membrane needs to be balanced between permeability and stability. These are all biologically based insights.
Yeah.
When you look at how life works, how cells work, there's a sthira and sukha to the cell, and there's a prana and apana to the cell, you know, and then the membrane, which is semi-permeable, has to let in what it needs, reject what it doesn't, keep in what it needs, and excrete what it doesn't, right? And so there's an intelligence terms that can be understood as a sthira sukha going on at the most fundamental levels of life. Anything that is living and successful has to have that same kind of, negotiate that same kind of balance. And so a learning environment is just as alive.
Yeah.
And so that's been a major evolution for me, just the things I've been sharing. And that's like that sthira sukha thing is the last 5 or 6 years. And then just all the traveling and teaching has really got me thinking about some of these issues in a clearer way. And not the least of which is the fact that we give students a survey to fill out for every workshop I teach. It's an online thing that they can log into. And we explicitly request critical feedback. We love the great quotes of how you loved it and all that, and maybe we'll ask to use it in promotional material. But, that's the easy part.
Yeah.
For any teacher to get praise. The tough part is the stuff that, tends to walk out the door and you never hear from them again because something you said or you didn't sit right with them. And the critical survey responses that we've gotten over the years, some of them were repetitive, meaning there were similar issues that people had across different workshops. Those are the ones we really pay attention to because that's where I have a blind spot. That's where I really need to learn something. And that's the hardest stuff to hear because it makes your stomach turn.
Yeah.
And I go through this whole talk in every workshop about how important it is for all of us as educators to give some opportunity to our students because no one likes conflict.
Yeah.
It's and this is again about the dynamics between people at the front of a room and people who are, being taught by them. We have to understand as educators that we are almost guaranteed to be exposed to far more praise than criticism.
Yeah.
That's what turns into cults.
Yeah.
Really.
Yeah.
When you're surrounded by people who only agree with you, who are afraid or not even registering the sketchy stuff because we naturally avoid conflict, and people in authority who are accepting those projections, they are unable to distinguish criticism from disrespect.
Yes. Yeah.
Right? And that's a cult.
Yeah.
So, I go to great lengths in the workshops to say, please take some time. You don't have to do it right away. Maybe you want to think about it for a day or a week or a month. We don't take these things down. They're there forever. But log in at some point, and if anything didn't sit right with you, or you have some critical feedback, or anything at all, as long as you deliver it politely, right? Please let us know. We really do read these things, and this is how we improve what we're doing.
Yeah.
That's been a major growth point for me since we've been traveling and teaching and putting these surveys out.
That's really good. I mean, I think that's such a great teaching for everybody who is a teacher who does workshops and has the opportunity to get feedback because, yeah, you're right. I mean, taking on that negative feedback or critical feedback, let's say, is how you grow. I mean, how are you going to actually be able to refine what you offer if you're not allowing in that sort of narrative?
Right, and it's the stuff people least like to deliver and you least like to hear, and that's what makes it so important. And in honesty, I think that was some of the spirit of what the Alliance was trying to do back when they were introducing this social credentialing thing. Is to have a form for feedback that could be anonymous if it needed to be, because there's repercussions in real life if you're in a training program. And maybe you want to be hired as a teacher by the studio that trained you, yet you have some critical things to say about the way you were trained. It's like, how is that going to sit?
Yeah.
What's that going to do to your prospects of gaining some employment at the place that you have some criticism for? So, and then, how do you prevent people from gaming the system and just flaming other people because they have some personal issue or vendetta that they want to enact and they're using, a rating system to destroy someone that they're having some beef with.
Yeah.
So, there's problematic ways of that reviewing mechanisms can be abused.
Yeah. Can they do it anonymously?
I've had rather lengthy discussions with the folks who were in leadership of the Alliance at the time. Andrew Tanner is one of the people who's a good friend of mine, and Brendan Hartzell, who was the president of the Alliance at the time. They were the ones who were trying to figure out how to get this to work. But then new leadership came in and other priorities kind of took over. But there are ways to make it work.
Yeah. Because I feel like when you can leave your feedback, I mean, I can see the reasoning and the justification for having being able to leave it anonymously, but also it does open
that
up.
Leaves it open for abuse.
Abuse, yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
And I mean, I've seen, several people who have been taken down through these sites, these essentially.
Well, you're talking to someone that has been at the other end of attempts to take me down through this online attacks, just fabricated stuff. So.
And how did you take on and resolve that within yourself?
Within myself?
Yeah, and there must have been.
Within myself, I know when something's not true.
Right.
I know that, but fortunately, it's just a couple of isolated people who, whenever we did have one event canceled in Portland.
That's where it would be.
That's where it would be. That's one of the places where it would be, where they claim they couldn't guarantee my physical safety if I showed up to teach this workshop.
Wow. Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, well, some people didn't like some things I said in an interview that I did with Michelle Goldberg about the whole Jiva Mukti scandal thing that they had a while back.
Yeah.
Some teacher abuse things that were going on.
Yes, I remember that. The Ruth thing.
Yeah, Ruth thing. Yeah, so I was quoted there, and, I wasn't aware of the fact that I was the only one she was interviewing who was willing to go on record. I should have asked. Michelle didn't do anything wrong, because she's a reporter, and, I didn't say anything was off the record or whatever. But, in retrospect, I could have said things in a better, more sensitive way. I didn't say anything that wasn't true, in my view.
Yeah.
But it really rubbed people the wrong way.
Yeah.
And then people jumped on the bandwagon.
Yeah.
And people,
This was early. I think this was early on in that whole conversation, right? I feel
this is when cancel culture was just beginning
emerging.
For what it was.
Yeah, when people were sort of a little more loose-lipped. That's the brand. When your brand is sort of taking down others for missteps, misstatements, and not sort of. I suppose.
Well, in all fairness, Matthew offered me the chance to recant or retract or otherwise, justify what I said, and I doubled down. So
I see.
It was
so you dug your own grave.
It's not like I wasn't warned.
All right. Well, you dug your own grave, Leslie. There's nothing we can do.
Exactly. But I have to live with myself in the end. Tire tracks and all.
That's what builds character. So I want to go back to kind of, your pedagogy has changed. We'll go back to your work, and I'm curious because obviously, as most people know, you've written this book on yoga anatomy with Amy Matthews. That's decades old at this point.
2007. It was originally first edition.
Oh, wow.
07.
Okay, so actually it was published just before I did my teacher training. So, okay, it's not as, when I got it, I remember thinking, it's been around a little bit longer.
Was it part of your teacher training?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's most, I feel like
more
at the time,
At
the time, I felt like it was in every yoga teacher training, really. I did it at 2009.
Can you say that again? You say that it should be in every yoga teacher training? Never mind.
Well, I think Leslie would like you to include the Yoga Anatomy book, and it's in your yoga teacher training, and it's a great book. But I'm curious how it's evolved. And speaking of critical feedback, I'm sure people have suggested that certain things should be included that weren't. Or how has the book, or how has your approach to yoga anatomy evolved since that book?
Well, it's evolved quite a bit because since the book was published in 2007, I've continued my education in anatomy, mostly in the lab at this point, because we do cadaver dissection. And we've started to lead our own cadaver dissection workshops. Not me and Amy, but me and a colleague of mine, Lori Nemitz, who has vast experience in the lab and is a master dissector. And but prior to that, I was doing most of my work with Gil Headley, who's a real pioneer in the sort of week-long cadaver dissection experience for non-medical people. That's where I had my first experiences of learning through dissection. So that certainly has been an evolution. And, more and more understanding, and this is something we added in the third edition, a whole brand new chapter called Anatomy is a Story that Amy and I co-wrote, just to let people...
Anatomy is a story.
Well, it is. It's a story told with a sharp instrument. The word itself means to cut up. Tome is a sharp instrument, right? So anatomy means to study something by cutting it up. And the minute you cut something up, it isn't what it was before you made that incision. And the decision that informs the incision, okay, means that these things that were connected in life are no longer connected. And you can say that something begins and ends here, and the next thing begins and ends here. And now you have, parts and structures that you can name. And it's very, very useful, obviously, to be able to do that in certain contexts. Now, yoga is more about understanding the connectivity between things and the interrelationship between things. And so a yoga version of anatomy, a yoga version of cutting into something to understand it, is more like using your consciousness, using your capacity to focus your awareness on your inner experience to learn about what's going on in there. And so that's no less a story than cutting with a sharp instrument. It's all a story. The question is, what purpose is the story for, And the main difference, of course, between cutting with a sharp instrument is the more you do that cutting, the less and less this thing that you're studying resembles what it was when it was alive. At the end of a week of cadaver dissecting, we've got a bunch of bags with things in it and skeletonized, and it looks a lot less than the donor looks a lot less than the way they looked at the beginning of the week. But the more you cut into your living system with your consciousness, the more alive it becomes. And both views are useful and necessary and incredibly informative. And so the way my understanding has evolved over the years is to negotiate these two worlds and see what relations they have to each other and how we can create learning experiences that embrace both views. How can you be more effective with your own consciousness working itself around in your system, which is a view of yoga practice? How can you be more successful doing that by learning how to do it with a scalpel? And what can be learned there? And how are the different ways you can dissect that honor the integrity and the layers, as opposed to, you can hold the scalpel, facing down, like perpendicular to the tissue, and cut down through the layers and separate one thing from another that way. And that's usually what regional anatomy is about. That's how medical students are trained and surgeons are trained. But what Gil Headley pioneered, and other people like, Tom Myers, and even some of the older anatomists, when you see their work, they went in layers. They were holding the scalpel more parallel to the planes of tissue and seeing where are the layers. And where's the integrity of the layers. So you get the whole anatomy trains model that Tom pioneered, right?
Fascia.
The myofascial meridians. So, there's that way of using a scalpel. So it's not just one way to cut with a sharp instrument either. So we try to bring those two conversations together in the lab. And that'll never end. I don't know any arrogant anatomists. I'm sure there are arrogant anatomists out there, but the ones that we hang out with, they're so humbled by this thing that we're studying and the infinite variation and variety that we're encountering in the lab. There's no thought that you could ever completely master it as a topic. It's always showing you new things. It's always showing you new views. It's always, producing stuff that you haven't seen before. And that's the fascination of that.
I think that's just a beautiful metaphor for the way I think knowledge acquisition should be in general. Like the idea that there's some sort of finite set of data points that one must memorize before one has a fully fleshed out understanding of something seems like an outdated model, and that there is a kind of almost infinite unfolding of and evolving of one's knowledge about something, because we're always changing as well, right?
Sure. Well, the thing that is being used to understand is always changing. That's our brains.
Yeah, right.
I mean, ultimately, anyone who studies the brain knows that we've just barely scratched the surface. If you ask the right questions about how it works, that have solid answers.
Yeah.
There's all these memes that come up from time to time about, neurophysiology, like mirror neurons, and that's been debunked. And, the left-right hemisphere model is not quite what we thought it was. And, we've got neuroplasticity, and now we've got the polyvagal theory. You've been around long enough, you see these waves of interest that purport to, give you a model to finally understand some of the things we're observing about how the brain works. But it's the most complex object in the known universe.
Yeah.
Using it to understand itself, that's a whole other level of mindfuck.
Yeah. So one of these waves of interest that you were just mentioning, waves of interest, is functional anatomy. And I'm curious what you think about this approach, because it seems like it's become popular with certain, I don't know, communities of yoga teachers. Does that inform the work that you do?
I don't know what the term functional anatomy is distinguishing itself from.
Right.
What's the alternative?
I guess functional anatomy is sort of, rather than this sort of, I guess, cutting incision model where one is looking sort of objectively at the parts of the body. Okay. And it's about the relationships between, it's about, it's about.
You start studying kinesiology, you're into functional anatomy.
I see.
So
they've rebranded kinesiology.
Well, I don't know if that's what it is. I don't use that term.
Okay.
And I know I've encountered it out there, but I haven't taken the trouble to understand what the differentia is.
Yeah.
The genus is, we're studying the body. I know what the word anatomy means from a variety of perspectives, but I'm assuming it's not being distinguished from non-functional anatomy.
Mm-hmm.
So the only reason that someone like me would study anatomy is to understand how the body functions.
Yeah.
To understand what we're seeing in front of our eyes when we teach a room full of people in movement. That's how it started for me. I was teaching a Shivananda class, and not everyone could do the postures. Mm-hmm. Like, why is this person able to do this and this person not able to do that? What is going on under the surface maybe in their bodies that lets someone easily do one posture and that same person has trouble with another, and vice versa. And so I started looking in books and seeing where the hamstrings are attached and where this or that was attached. And it's like, okay, things started making a little bit more sense, So for me, the whole reason to even approach a topic like anatomy was to understand on a more functional level what was in front of me as someone that was teaching yoga. So it sounds redundant. In other words, functional anatomy sounds, because the whole reason for me to be interested in anatomy is to understand function.
Yes. So that's really interesting. Yeah. Maybe it is sort of a kind of contemporary term that's rebranded something that's
I think there's straw manning, frankly. I think there's straw manning regional anatomy.
Right.
I think there's straw manning the way Western medical people study anatomy.
I see.
Maybe what they're doing.
Okay.
Yeah. Which is easy enough to do.
Yeah.
Because I've had doctors come in to some of my anatomy courses when I was teaching them, at the Breathing Project in New York. And they studied anatomy. Their first year med students study anatomy, regional anatomy, and you go through a year or a semester, whatever it is, of dissection, and you're learning it. You're learning what you need to learn to pass the test about anatomy. And then depending on what specialty you go into, if it's surgery, of course, you have to really, really know your stuff, right? Mm-hmm. But that's still a particular lens, a particular way of understanding anatomy. But they don't get any kinesiology unless they're going into ortho, mm-hmm. And even there, it's just with the understanding of what the mechanics are of what you're repairing. A physiatrist would have a little bit more, perhaps. but still, it's a particular medicalized lens. And they come in and they see yoga and what we're doing and how we're talking about anatomy, and it's a whole new world for them. So it's pretty easy to straw man that sort of medicalized anatomy training that people have in Western medicine and say, oh no, we're studying functional anatomy.
Yeah.
We said, this isn't that. So I'm just talking out of my ass here. I don't really know.
I think that, I mean, that's probably a safe hypothesis, and maybe I'll bring a functional anatomy person on.
Sure.
If you're out there, send me an email.
Yeah, tell me I'm wrong. Tell me I'm full of shit. Yeah.
So I want to ask about something that just kind of occurred to me, because I remember when I was still in New York, and obviously prior to COVID, what seemed to be happening, at least in the yoga communities that I was a part of, was an anatomy craze. And this took the form of, New Yorkers want to be the smartest people in the room, let's be honest, right? They're like, that's their thing. And I think that the form of intelligence for a yoga teacher took on a lot of acquiring a vast terminology of anatomy. And so I know. And so what I ended up finding in classes, it just started to, it was like you were being washed with all of this terminology and all of this hyper detail specificity about like what's going on in your hip. And I was like, I'm a yoga teacher and I can't access what you're telling me right now. And it's completely distracting.
Right. You're supposed to be micromanaging all of it on a moment-to-moment basis.
Yeah.
Yeah. Were you taking Iyengar classes?
No, I don't want to say the studio because I still have a great relationship with that studio.
Okay.
But there were, and I think that actually it's kind of softened now. But there were, and it wasn't all the teachers, but were certain teachers where, it was a studio that's sort of known for its intelligence. I do think that there was an anatomy teacher that I know that was kind of very hot to the. I'm sorry, a Iyengar teacher was really hip to the anatomy trainer. Sure. But just generally speaking, it's like, I would, for me personally, like I guess I would be more attracted to the development of someone's sort of philosophical knowledge, subtle knowledge about yoga. To me, that's more meaningful and also like more the point. But there really was this kind of like deep development of and escalation of anatomy terminology in the classroom in a regular yoga class.
No, I've run into that.
So what do you think?
When I run into that, I run into that when I don't take other people's classes anymore because they see me, they recognize me, and then that starts spilling out of their mouth.
Right.
And so
got to impress the anatomy guru.
Oh, yeah, and it's so uncomfortable. Sure. First of all, we have to understand that kind of anatomy knowledge and language, the ability to understand it and express it. This is, just to go back to the hemispheric model of the brain for a moment, that's very left brain stuff we're talking about. Mm-hmm. It's very language-based, linear kinds of processing. And if you're being asked to experience your body in real time that way with the words that are coming out of someone's mouth, like, I've heard people teach asana like, I want you to flex your shoulder joint and externally rotate it and then flex it. It's like, these step-by-step instructions, almost like you're assembling an IKEA piece of furniture, and teaching asana that way to me is just maddening. It just drives me crazy. And then to throw all this anatomical stuff on top of that way of asking your students to process what you're saying into their bodies, you're leaving out a more global, holistic, organic way of experiencing yourself. And let's just say for the moment that that's how the right half of your brain processes information. The parallel processing as opposed to the serial processing, if you want to use computer terms. You're just kind of locking people into this very linear, reductionistic way of understanding reality. And as far as I can tell, people come into a yoga class needing to bust out of some of that. And to whatever extent our book or anything I've taught or put out there in the world has made people think that this is a good way to teach yoga, I apologize.
You heard it here first.
Well, no, because seriously, when the book first came out, Amy and I were horrified to hear that some people thought it was a practice manual. Meaning they were going through the analysis we did of each pose and then trying to, get each joint in their body to do the thing that we were describing. And they were like, they were using it as a recipe for further micromanaging their neuromuscular musculoskeletal existence. And it's like, no, it's not a practice manual.
Yeah.
It's a reference book that lets you know what's happening when you put your body into a shape from a starting position. So yeah, there is that way of teaching, and like you, it's like nails on a chalkboard.
Yeah.
And I don't really understand the value of it, other than showing off.
It's showing.
I think it's showing off.
It's showing.
I think it's an insecurity that many people have, because let's face it, when you approach a field that's as vast as anatomy, it's impossible to not feel insecure in terms of how much you know versus how much there is to know. And I think a lot of people think the more they can learn and the more they can memorize and the more they can spit back out their mouth of what they've memorized, the less insecure they'll feel around their anatomy. So I think there's some insecurity there.
Yeah.
That's being compensated for. I avoid anatomical language as much as I possibly can when I'm teaching. I avoid the words right and left when I'm teaching. I don't use them. I don't care if my class is all doing the same thing in unison or facing the same way. I promote a certain amount of creative chaos in the classroom intentionally, because I want people to understand what informs their choice to step forward with this leg or that leg. That's fuel for an inquiry.
Yeah.
Right. So I don't even direct them as far as right and left is concerned. I'm certainly not going to say, okay, now we're going to do something for your hamstrings. If someone asks a question about a problem they're having and it's answerable with some anatomy that's going to help them. Yeah. But I don't spew it out there.
Yeah.
That to me is just taking things in the classroom in the wrong direction.
Well, that brings up an interesting question of how then do we as teachers translate the anatomical knowledge to a supportive container for the student, or rather, how do you transmit that in a way that actually is fruitful rather than overwhelming?
Sure. I don't think it's a direct transmission. I think you translate it into your own practice, translate it into your own understanding of your body, digest it, and then the words that come out will have some meaning. So yeah, I think you're skipping a step.
Yes.
You think that the stuff that you learn anatomically is going to directly come out your mouth and help your students without having really ingested, digested, and fully embodied what it is you learn. Because otherwise it's just some mental masturbation. That you're doing publicly.
And we're not supposed to masturbate publicly.
We're not supposed to masturbate at all. Haven't you heard?
Wow, that's really interesting. And
you didn't go to Catholic school, did you?
I actually went to Lutheran private school until I was in 10th grade. And then fortunately I left and went to public school because I joined the choir of the public school. So I was able to escape. But yeah, but I certainly was indoctrinated with all of that. Yeah. And I still don't masturbate. So.
Oh, good to hear. Good to hear.
So I want to.
I can't wait to see the post-production version of this.
No, this is the kind of stuff I leave in, Leslie. This is what keeps people coming back. So the one thing that came up before we started our conversation that I kind of wanted to, well, we're about an hour and a half in, so maybe we'll start to wrap things up. And I wanted to ask about this beautiful thing that you'd mentioned before we started talking, which was the relationship between so obviously you do anatomy, obviously, as we're talking about, but actually really one of the ways in which I feel like many people were introduced to your work was through this project called the Breathing Project, and you're you're much focused on the breath. And that to me is a really important piece of the anatomy work that you do, because you can't, if you're looking at anatomy without thinking about the breath, it's just a dead cadaver, right? And the breath brings this sort of prana. It brings life to the body.
Well, that's why we feel okay about putting scalpels to the donors, because they're not breathing.
Right. Yeah, you probably wouldn't bring scalpels to.
Oh, I'd be a surgeon then.
Yes.
That's
not
another gig.
That's not in your wheelhouse.
No.
But I loved that you had mentioned that when you're teaching the anatomy of the mouth, you use the Sanskrit letters as a way of kind of teaching that. And I've been doing a lot of interviews with Sanskrit folks, because I study Sanskrit myself, and I'm very fascinated with, and in some ways I feel like a kind of commitment to encourage and inspire other people to study Sanskrit, because it is such a beautiful, I think it's a contemplative practice.
It is, and it's one of the few existing languages that has a perfectly consistent and logical structure to it, where things are spelled exactly as they're pronounced.
Right.
And they're pronounced exactly as they're spelled.
So how does that then help with teaching about the anatomy of the mouth?
Well, this came up because before we started recording, I saw on your shelf there my friend Vyas Houston's Sanskrit by CD.
Mm-hmm.
Is it Sanskrit by MP3 now? Has it evolved even further?
I don't actually know. I haven't.
Get Vyas on the podcast.
I think I've reached out to him, so maybe I'll use you as a connector to get him on here.
Yeah. No, I was, as I said, I was there when he was launching the.
That's incredible. How long has it been going?
I was trying to think of when that must have been. It was probably 1989 in New York at my old studio, Yogatone. That
Yes.
Announced that he was launching the Sanskrit training. So yeah, this is just purely the phonetics. The grammar and everything else is beyond me. I have a good working vocabulary that one acquires by spending time at an ashram and so on.
Right.
But it was the phonetics that enthralled me, because as it was explained to me, and as I began to recognize, the Sanskrit alphabet, the way it's laid out, is literally a map of the mouth. So you have the 5 locations, and the way that the vowels and semivowels are constructed. It's this whole understanding that the ancient people had of how sound is produced in human by human anatomy, that is beautifully expressed in the alphabet and is easily taught by going through the alphabet. So, for example, I'll start with getting people to understand what a root vowel is. You start with ah, you go to e, you go to u, and then, you get people to feel where that's coming from. Yeah. And then you just start working with some of the diphthongs, and you get to I chant a little differently than Vyas, actually, but it's, like, ah, e, u, e, I, e, o, al, aham. I don't do ha, I do aham. Mm-hmm. That turns into a mantra.
Yes, of course, yeah.
So, and so once you get people in a rhythm like that, you start injecting some of the consonants. And you can start at the front or the back, whatever you want. But, eventually you're getting to do things like ma, ma, me, me, my, mo, mel, ma, mum, ba, ba, be, be, boo, boo, be, bye, bo, bow, ba, bum, ba, pa, beep, beep, boop, boop, be, bye, bo, bow, ba, pum. People start laughing when we do that, because papa and pee, pee, and poo, poo. And But that brings up a whole interesting conversation. Why are those baby sounds?
Yeah.
Because the first part of their vocal apparatus that babies are articulating with are their lips.
Yeah.
And things that are most important to a newborn baby is is mama and papa and some pee pee and poo poo, and baba. Baba is like a bottle or a breast or something, right? Mm-hmm. It's like, wow, if you look at all the languages on the planet, at the words for mother, they're going to be in that labial range,
Yeah.
Mama, ima, ama, So all these interesting conversations evolve, but it's just a model that I've used, like a scaffold, really, for the teaching of what's going on in the soft palate, with the tongue, with the lips, in the throat. So the lessons in my yoga anatomy course, which are now online because the Breathing Project no longer exists as a studio.
Yeah.
When we get to that part, we're using the Sanskrit alphabet as a way for exploring.
Beautiful.
Systematically.
I love that.
Yeah.
That's really great. So I wanted to end on this question of recently at Embodied Philosophy, we hosted this one-day summit called Future of the Yoga Teacher, and I brought Ava on, and I brought a few other folks on to talk about different, essentially, different considerations about, post-COVID, how the yoga world has changed, and how we navigate this world. A part of it is like really pragmatically and from a business perspective, like how do I build a yoga business now? But
I'm glad you got Ava on that, because
she's real good. She's definitely thought a lot about it.
To get that book published. That's my publisher, Human Kinetics.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. That was
wow.
Totally an inside job.
Oh, my gosh.
That was a total
full circle.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, I just signed a contract with Human Kinetics, so now I'm probably...
there you go. You're part of the team. They're going to ask me to review your book. I'll probably say yes. I've actually said no to a couple.
Oh, well, it was signed contract was for it's to actually for us to sell her book. Yeah.
Oh, I see.
So you haven't published my book yet.
Oh.
But I'll have to shop around for the right publisher. But I'll keep you on the list. So what is what do you see as the challenges of yoga teachers now in this kind of post-COVID world? And how do you see, like, what's your sort of optimistic view about the future of yoga, and what's sort of, if you have one, your cynical view? Yeah.
Well, it's the same view. My optimistic view includes a certain amount of cynicism, because it has to be. Otherwise, it's just pie in the sky, not reality-based optimism. Okay, so I'm the big tent guy, right? I'm the one who says, yeah, you wanna teach weed yoga, or beer yoga, or doga, or broga, or hot whatever yoga. Fine. Does it turn my stomach a little bit when I see one of these weird permutations? Because it's not my personal cup of tea. Sure, but I've learned, that's one of the things I've learned to give a little space to and not react to.
Right.
Because, and this is, you may think it's a cynical point of view, but it's a practical point of view. The slice of the overall yoga pie that nourishes me and my family is a very, very thin slice. I would be a fool to argue against the pie itself getting bigger.
Yeah.
My proportion of it won't get bigger proportional to the whole pie, but if the pie gets bigger, it gets more nourishing.
Yeah.
And the reason it gets more nourishing is because, maybe 1 in 100 people who go to Doga or Broga or whatever will develop, as a result of being asked to move and breathe at the same time, some kind of transformational experience that makes them want to go deeper. They'll eventually find maybe someone like me. So I think the pie should be as big as possible, include as many people as possible, and no one has the right to say that you are not allowed to teach that yoga because I think it's stupid.
Yeah.
And you're denigrating the good name of yoga by attaching these other things to it, right? People who are the self-appointed yoga police.
Yeah, a lot of that.
They are insecure busybodies, for the most part. Who really feel that they have the right to become the yoga police.
Yeah.
And so I don't agree with that point of view.
Yeah.
The more the merrier, as far as I'm concerned. Because in the age of the internet, if you have an interest in yoga and you look up the Wikipedia entry for yoga, you're not going to find broga or doga or weed yoga or hot, booty,
Hot booty yoga.
No, what is it? Yoga booty ballet.
Yes,
that's
yoga booty ballet.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you're going to find, the history of yoga, right? In all of its complexity and, depth and whatever. So anyone that wants to look a little deeper into this thing that has given them some benefit, because look, if that's what it takes to get someone on a mat, is the prospect of bringing your dog with you or whatever, or a goat climbing on you, fine. As long as once you're on that mat, someone at some point is going to ask you to move and breathe at the same time. That's what opens the door of all these possibilities.
Yeah.
So that to me is the optimistic view. And if you want to call it the cynical view, it's like people are going to find a way to, brand it for a particular audience that they think they can make money off of. That's just the free market operating.
Yeah.
I'm a free market guy. I'm not the one to say you shouldn't be able to do that, you know? So if I have a cynical bone in my body about all of this, it's that, you know, people are going to be exploitive. They're going to try to game the system. They're going to try to use social media algorithms to promote some idea about yoga that has nothing to do with their authentic experience or anything that's authentically transformed them. It's going to be all flash. And let's face it, any mid-level gymnast in any high school, anywhere in the country, can do asanas in front of a camera and look impressive.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean squat.
Doesn't mean squat.
But if you
But they're getting a lot of yoga gigs from their Instagram posts.
You were a cynical person who saw that this is how you can have a teaching career in the yoga space, and you just set up a tripod and did these things and see that. So, you know, but that's just the free market in operation. The cream will flow to the top. The shit will sink. I don't know. Does healthy shit sink or does healthy shit float? I'm not sure how that works.
I think healthy shit floats.
Yeah, whatever. But you see my point. The truth will come out in the long run.
Yeah.
You know, and so that's my optimistic point of view.
Yeah.
That in the end, the small percentage of people that are truly interested in quality will find their tribe.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I think of it in terms of music too. You know, like the conductor of the Philharmonic isn't out there trying to put a beating on P. Diddy because he thinks what he's doing isn't music.
Yeah.
You know, it's like you know, does he have opinions? Maybe, but why would he want to enforce them on someone else that's enjoying rap?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
I know a classical scholar who is one of the top music theorists in the world. He's an expert on Renaissance music. He's also an expert on hip hop. Because it fascinates him from a theory point of view.
Yeah.
You know? So there's tents that are big enough for everyone.
Well, what I hear what you're saying, and I really appreciate what you're saying, is sort of like a kind of a realist and a pragmatist argument. The realist is more like, you know, these things are going to happen whether or not you want them to or not. Like, people are going to invent new modes. It's been happening since the dawn of time. And no matter, and the idea that one could sort of police that is in some sense naive and adolescent.
Yeah.
And then on the other hand, the pragmatist argument is that, well, you know, even if we might, you know, bristle and roll our eyes at goat yoga, like that may be the gateway just for them to actually, maybe in then 10 years, they're going to be a yoga philosopher or something, like, or, you know, someone who's deeply into the subtle aspects of the tradition, and you just have no idea what the trajectory of an individual student is going to be. So we want more gateways into that. And I guess that the fear, you know, for someone who's striking a critical position would be that, well, if we confuse this space more and more with all these alternatives, then the option to find that, you know, true yoga, I'm using that in air quotes, becomes less and less. So do you just like think that that's, like you're saying, that cream ultimately rises to the top and that eventually those things naturally unfold in a positive direction?
If you have issues with stuff other people are doing, I would say take whatever energy you have around that and redirect it into creating a superior product.
Right, yeah.
That's true to you and true to your aspirations, and trust that there are people in the universe who will resonate with that.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe talk to someone like Ava about the efficient ways to get it out there in the marketplace.
Mm-hmm. She's going to love that you said that on this.
Yeah, well, there you go. But yeah, I've had people show up in workshops who are very deeply committed to this path, who started in a gym. They were fitness instructors. They were trained by YogaFit,
mm-hmm.
you know, as one of these instructors back then, and they just found a path and they followed it and they followed it and they followed it, you know. And what would that have been like for them if someone had shut that down and said, no, this isn't yoga, you shouldn't do it, we're coming in and we're shutting your doors?
Yeah.
Not that anyone would ever have the power to do that, but some people would make it if they did.
Yeah. What if redirecting someone's attention onto their own product is a product that's about criticizing and tearing down all of these other lesser than products.
Oh, they'll find their tribe too.
Yeah.
I mean, they already have,
Yeah.
So they haven't stopped me yet,
Right.
Yeah.
You're still getting invited to give podcast interviews.
Yeah, well, this may be the last one.
I don't know. Will it be the poop that gets them, or will it be the cultural commentary? We'll have to see.
Oh, the parts that it would be.
Well, Leslie, it's been really fun. I'm so glad I was able to have you in my studio/home and to talk with some new fancy equipment around us, and for people to be able to see this on video if they want to. And actually, maybe I should mention that for those that are still just listening to this podcast, Leslie and I are in my home in London with video cameras, and this will soon be or you'll be able to watch the video version of these episodes on our Chitheads YouTube channel. So if you'd like to check that out, go ahead and look it up.
Awesome. And you'll post all the contact stuff for me along with the episode.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. We'll link to all those.
That wasn't a question. That was
a demand. So Leslie, what are you up to in the future? I want to end with that, actually. How can people get in touch with you? How can people see what you're doing? When are you doing more workshops? What's the online presence and all of that?
Well, everything's collected on my personal website, which is yogaanatomy.org. And that's 2 A's, yogaanatomy.org.
No dash.
So there's another one with 1 A, and it's not me. There's no dash, just one word, yogaanatomy.org. And there's links to all the stuff I'm doing there, including my teaching calendar and some online content I've put together, like a subscription service, and also the online courses that we've put up, which were the ones we were teaching at the Breathing Project, which are now online. And sort of the most successful one is the fundamentals, where it's an online way of providing the 20 or 30 or whatever hours that are required for a teacher training program.
Right.
That's both me and Amy, with much more than 20 or 30 hours of resources behind it. And
yeah.
So that's proved to be a very useful thing for all these sort of online trainings.
Absolutely. Incredible. All right. So you heard it. Yogaanatomy.net. I've been speaking with Leslie Kaminoff.
Yogaanatomy.net are the online courses.
Yogaanatomy.org is your personal website.
We do have yoga. Those are the online courses, .net, and then the .org is my personal website.
All right. Thank you for that.
That's it. Thank you.
I almost sent people in the wrong direction.
No. That was a good website.
Okay, good. All right. I've been speaking with Leslie Kaminoff, author, along with Amy Matthews of Yoga Anatomy. Leslie, thank you so much.
Been a pleasure. Been fun.